Good evening. Now, here's a conundrum for you. How do you position yourself as the change candidate when your party's been in power for 13 years? Well, I guess one way might be to rubbish those who've gone before you. Because today, at his big speech at Conservative Party conference, Rishi Sunak promised to end what he called 30 years of the status quo, which basically means every Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher, including 5 Conservative ones. No wonder David Cameron isn't happy. He's tweeted to publicly criticise the decision to scrap the second leg of HS2, really a symbol of his legacy being torn up. I mean, remember, David Cameron didn't even feel the need to intervene during the Liz Truss chaos. But this is the thing. If you're going to rip up 30 years of consensus, effectively comparing yourself to Thatcher, well, you've got to be radical. And looking at the policy announcements in the speech, scrapping the second leg of HS2, introducing a new post-16 qualification, increasing the smoking age, the only thing I can see that links them is they don't cost money. Unsurprising, perhaps, given this is a man who's also pitching himself as the candidate for economic credibility. But radical, exciting change and sensible, prudent money is quite difficult to be both of those things. Not impossible, but difficult. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, reports now from Manchester on the challenge facing the Prime Minister.
All this week, Conservative Conference has been trying to come to terms with a leader they didn't vote for. This a PM who's been battered from the fringe sidelines and beset by leaks preempting what he needs to be, a game-changing speech. Pulling out all the stops in the most personal of ways. This, the first PM introduction by a political spouse since 2009.
Rishi and I are each other's best friends.
This is a reset for her as much as him, thanks to difficult coverage around Mrs Murty's tax affairs last year. This a couple now in election mode. His slogans, now hers.
Rishi, you know this. You know they're doing the right thing for the long term. Even when it's hard, is the right thing to do.
This a scene from a presidential playbook. This a Prime Minister making a personal pitch.
My story is a British story. A story about how a family can go from arriving here with little to Downing Street in 3 generations. Now, I am proud to be the first British Asian Prime Minister. But you know what? I'm even prouder that it's just not a big deal.
Today, all about connecting with voters, and it moved his Education Secretary to tears in the room. A speech as much about where he came from as where he wants to go next.
HS2 is the ultimate example of the old consensus.
Mr Sunak modelling himself as a reformer ready to take tough decisions. High-speed rail to the north, the first casualty.
I am ending this long-running saga. I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project. And in its place, we will reinvest every single penny, £36 billion, in hundreds of new transport projects in the North and the Midlands across the country.
The PM delighted to have got it off his chest. Announcements too on smoking, with the legal age being raised by a year every year. And big reform in education, a new qualification system for 16 to 19-year-olds in England. And plenty of politics too. Goading Keir Starmer.
He is the walking definition of the 30-year political status quo I am here to end.
And trying to take Labour into culture war territory.
And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
What's going on here is this is a Prime Minister behind in the polls, asking you to take another look at him. All week he's been trying to connect with the party. This was a message to the country as he goes into the fight of his political life. Alex, hello. What did you make of the speech? Did he do what he needed to do?
It was bold, it was decisive, it was visionary, he's taking tough decisions. I thought it was a really important speech, and it's one that puts this country on a course to a better future. So, I thought it was amazing.
Do you think he's going to be able to get the public to give him another look now?
I hope so, and I think from what I've seen, there was a lot there which is really inspirational.
But key components of the PM's new Northern Network, in reality a rehash of previous Tory plans postponed or cancelled. The Prime Minister just delivered to deliver the Northern Powerhouse rail in full, which runs through Bradford. The Chancellor canned this in the integrated rail plan. Canned it.
Yes, we have, because his judgment is...
And then you're putting money into projects he cancelled.
The government's judgment is the £36 billion that we were going to spend on HS2 is better spent on different transport connections across the north of England, east to west.
Talking about the long term, but this all about driving his short-term political prospects up. A man in a hurry. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Manchester.
We'll be talking to Beth to get her take in just a moment, but I did speak to the Transport Minister, Hugh Merriman, a little earlier. He defended that decision on high-speed rail.
So part of the challenge of it, I'm the HS2 Minister,
yeah.
so it's for me to deal with, is that it's going over budget, it's going over time, and as we look at it and some of the travel patterns changing, we've just taken a view that £36 billion can be better spent across other northern cities, reducing journey times, improving capacity and connections. And so we bring Hull into play, whereas it had been left out. We bring Bradford into play with a new station, which is something I've worked really hard on with the leader of Bradford City Council. So all of a sudden, those cities actually get a benefit. And look, I've scrutinised this project as well, because I used to chair the Transport Select Committee, and I looked at this project a lot. And it was certainly the case that Bradford felt that it had really missed out. And if you grow one area to the expense of another, Bradford being the youngest city, one of the youngest cities in the country, then actually Bradford loses out. So under these changes, and not just for Bradford, for Sheffield, Leeds, Hull, York, and of course between Manchester and Liverpool, £12 billion spent on rail there. So it's about making sure that all the money that's saved from the north, from HS2, is actually being reinvested in the north, just more further across than just up and down.
So what you're effectively saying is, we can't build this one bit of transport, but just trust us to build all these other bits instead.
Well, a very large piece of transport will be built from Euston, actually, and not just to Birmingham, but north of Birmingham onto the
London bit.
link, and then...
We've heard that before, isn't it? What a surprise! Oh, look, we're going to build the London bit in full. I mean, imagine if you're in one of these...
You could actually call it the Birmingham bit, or you could actually call it the bit that connects onto the West Coast Main Line, north of Birmingham, which is the Handsacre link.
Okay,
so those trains will still go up.
You're building a bit in the south.
So Euston will remain the starting point from a London perspective, Curzon Street for Birmingham, and then it will be connected onto the West Coast Main Line at Handsacre, taking HS2 trains to Manchester. But the key part is what it does for all the cities that weren't directly benefiting from HS2, and now they'll benefit from the recycling of £20 billion of the 36 billion. Everything that's saved from the north gets spent in the north, and all on transport. Everything that's saved in the Midlands, so almost 10 billion, goes on the Midlands. So that will connect about 40 different towns across the Midlands with the Midlands hub. So there is a huge amount for the wider part of the geography. So people watching this who don't live in Manchester will actually get some benefit from this, whereas maybe they wouldn't have done before.
I was delighted to see our old friend, the A1 upgrade announcement, returning to yet another conference speech. I think it was David Cameron in 2014 that did it. But that's exactly the problem, right? I've been at lots of conference speeches where lots of things have been announced and just haven't happened. Why on earth should we trust it this time when we've heard it from you guys so many times in the past?
So look, Sam, that's a fair challenge, and my job now is to actually sort of get down and be the project manager and make sure that on the rail side all of these things do occur. But one of the big challenges for me, and trying to plan the portfolio I've got, is that when I think I can do something, so I've always wanted to do the Ely freight project. It's got a BCR of 4.6, brilliant for freight, but we hadn't got the money because HS2 just sucks the money out of the department because we've seen it go over budget. So now I feel we can do these things because we've gripped it in terms of that cost. We've said we can't afford it. We'll recycle it all.
That was Hugh Merriman's take. Let's get Beth Rigby's take, shall we? She's our political editor. She is now outside a deserted conference centre. Beth, it probably feels like you're the last person in Manchester, but thanks for staying on for us.
I am.
I'm keen to talk about the HS2 story in a minute, but first, you spent a few days now in Manchester. It was a big moment for Rishi Sunak, his conference pitch. How did he do?
Well, look, there were so many different things he was trying to do in that speech, talking to the party, talking to the country, taking the fight to Labour, and trying to really revive a stuttering Premiership, if you like, and at least get into the fight for the next general election. And I think, you know, if I was going to sum up that speech, I think a big element was a Prime Minister that came into power really through a few or a number of Conservative MPs, never had to make a pitch to the nation, so sort of introducing himself in quite a presidential style with his wife. We haven't seen that since 2009, so there was a lot about his backstories, his beliefs, his values, but then when you got down to the nitty-gritty of the politics, this was a Prime Minister positioning as a long-term decision maker, but with an eye everything on the short term of the next general election, be that in scrapping HS2 to create a dividing line with Labour and then be able to promise different pockets of money to constituents and voters he might want to attract, be that about the motorist policies, be that about net zero actually. So I think there's a short-termism in this, an electoral calculation. I think the second big thing about it for me, Sophie, was when he talked about being a candidate for change. He talked about Labour being the status quo. And I thought that's quite a thing to pull off when you are leading a party that's been in government for 13 years. But he doesn't actually have an option. If you look at polling, what voters will overwhelmingly say is they want change. So in that situation, if you're Rishi Sunak, you cannot fight a campaign as being a continuity candidate, fight a campaign saying don't risk it on that lot because they might mess it up. You have to position yourself as a change candidate. So he had to try and break from the past. He had to try and come up with what he saw were radical policies that set him apart from others. And he's creating dividing lines, be it on HS2, be it on motorists, be it on gender policy. Interesting to see if he can draw Labour into that dividing line. It's all about trying to represent change. But my goodness, it's a big ask when you've been in power for 13 years, the Conservative brand is really tarnished and you are that far behind in the polls.
Yeah, it certainly is a big ask. One of the key parts of the speech, of course, was the junking of the second part of high-speed rail. He's tried to sweeten the pill with that £36 billion of spending elsewhere. Do you think that's enough to do it?
Well, look, Sophie, it's been really interesting after the speech. I mean, look, it was the worst kept secret in Manchester, wasn't it? Everyone was writing and talking and announcing that the speech was all, was going to scrap the northern leg. The Prime Minister refusing to admit that until he had his moment on the stage. And I thought he was really feeling vindicated there as he went through all the other policies. He really wanted to get it off his chest. But look, let's talk a bit about the policy because, Labour sources are pointing out tonight that almost all of the proposals can't be described as new investments. Much of it has already been promised. If you think about something, for example, the Bradford to Manchester connectivity, that's been promised in the last 3 Conservative manifestos, and a number of the projects, as I was making the point to Mark Harper, they were already promised. So you could argue, and I think it will be argued by opponents, that they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're scrapping HS2 Northern Leg, and then they're going to reinvest that money into projects that they'd already promised. So I think that will become a big debate. Why are they doing it? Look, politically, Labour have committed to HS2. It's in their national policy document. So now they can make the argument to Labour. And just quickly, the backlash from the Conservatives to David Cameron saying tonight it's the wrong decision and it will help fuel the views of those who argue we can no longer think or act for the long term. So opposition will pile in, the Conservative Party will pile in, and he's creating, as I said, a dividing line in the hope people might notice.
Well, let's see if they do notice. Beth Rigby, thank you very much indeed, our political editor there in Manchester. Now we're going to be speaking to our panel in just a moment, getting their reaction to the speech. But first, I just want to bring you some breaking news tonight about the US bank Metro Bank. Our city editor, Mark Kleiman, is here. First time on the show. Welcome to Politics Hub.
Thanks, Sophie.
What can you tell us?
Yeah, so Metro Bank is a newcomer, relative newcomer on the British High Street. It was born after the financial crisis of 2008 and has now about 75 branches across high streets in Britain, 2.7 million customers. So it's a significant bank. It's not one of the big four, but it's in the 10 largest British banks, retail banks. And what I've learned today is that Metro Bank is now trying to raise hundreds of millions of pounds of new capital, both debt and equity, from the markets to shore up its troubled balance sheet. Now, Metro Bank has had financial difficulties in the past. It's been fined by the regulators. It's had a pretty checkered history, actually, considering it's only been around for about a decade. One of the challenges it's got, Sophie, is that it's trying to raise more than £100 million by selling new shares to investors. But because Metro Bank's share price has fallen so far in the last month alone, it's halved. The company is now only worth about £100 million. That's going to make selling new shares of that order of magnitude pretty tough to do. And what I understand is that the banking regulators are now keeping a very close eye on Metro Bank to see whether this capital raising can be successful. The board of Metro Bank is exploring a range of options, including whether it can sell a chunk of its mortgage book, potentially whether it should sell the entire company. And this matters because we've seen some significant developments in UK banking this year when HSBC, for example, had to bail out Silicon Valley Bank over that weekend back in February. Now, there's no suggestion that Metro Bank is in imminent financial distress, but regulators are going to be keeping a very close eye on whether it can secure this new capital from investors. And bear in mind that 2.7 million customers is a significant portion of the British banking industry.
Yeah, it certainly is. Thank you very much for the update, Mark. I'm sure you'll be keeping across that story for us as well. Mark Kleiman now, City Editor. Right, let's get some reaction now, shall we, to the PM speech and the kind of wider, just get tangled up there, goings on at conference. We are joined now by the Chief Executive at the Fire Foundation, former Home Office advisor Nimco, and the columnist for The Times and the Evening Standard, also a former speechwriter for Tony Blair. That's Philip Collins. Thanks very much for having you on the programme. Nimco, you were at a conference, but you did the sensible thing, not like me with my mad dash today. You left yesterday.
I did leave yesterday because I've got to be at the next party conference next week as well at Labour. So in order to be able to push those issues that the women that we work with are facing, I was there.
What did you make of the atmosphere there?
It was quite joyful. I thought one of the things I thought was a little bit cringy was the flip-flops, but I did actually really like the Christmas jumpers with Margaret Thatcher on them.
The flip-flops, this is the Keir Starmer flip-flops,
This is
right?
the Keir Starmer.
They're trying to push that message quite hard, And what did you make of the Prime Minister's speech?
I thought it was very powerful and sweet in the sense that I think what Rishi is trying to do is trying to set himself as different from the last 13 years. And I think the really interesting thing about our party politics is the fact that they are such broad churches, whether it's the Conservatives or Labour. So I think you can actually have different prime ministers as we've seen in the last 12 months within one political party. So I think this was an opportunity for him to set himself as I can be the leader, I am the leader, so just give me a chance. And I hope his party does anyway.
What's your take on the speech?
Well, I think, as you've all said, the speech really exhibited a big choice, didn't it? What we learned today was how they're going to fight the next election. And the standard thing you'd expect at this point in the cycle, 13 years in, is to say the country's on the right course, please don't turn back. But literally the country is not on the right course. He's saying that the country is essentially broken, the 30 years of consensus has to be stopped, and I'm the change candidate. It's a very bold thing to try and do. I think it's wildly implausible. I understand why they got there. I do understand, and your conversation with Beth brought it out, which is that they have sensed that there is a mood for change, and they've concluded we can't resist that, therefore we've got to try and tap into it. I just don't think it's possible to do that. And I think that I would have made the other choice. I would have decided to have embraced the 13 years, taken from them what you could advertise as their virtues, and then you've got the chance of saying the risk of change is now significant. And at that point, you do a very brutal attack on the opposition. So that's the choice I would have made. But they've chosen to do the opposite thing. So it was certainly courageous, and in one sense, I kind of admire the sheer effrontery of it. I quite admire too, in a funny way, the fact that he went to Manchester and told Manchester it wasn't going to get a train wreck.
Not just in Manchester, but in an old railway hall in Manchester. I mean, you can make this stuff up.
But I think in terms of the choice between being a candidate of change, I think it's a generational conversation. I think Rishi's seeing himself within that young 40s millennium kind of group who are kind of like, stuck at a crossroads. So the whole point is, I think he can, and I say that as somebody that's within that kind of thing, seen as a change candidate, because he's completely different to the other prime ministers, even though they were all from the same political party. And then if you can see if Keir Starmer is going to go back to New Labour and go back into those kind of things again, do we want to go back in history, or do we want to go and have a change? So I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation of what else is possible, essentially.
But it was a speech that normally you'd do the year before you become Prime Minister, not the year after you've become Prime Minister.
Because I guess he's got track record as well.
Yeah, it was a speech that was to say, the country's in a mess, I'm the man who can fix it.
I'm interested in your insights as someone who is a former speechwriter, right? You work with Tony Blair, but I always hear rumours that are you advising Keir Starmer at all?
Not now, I have worked with Keir Starmer.
Worked with him before.
Yeah.
So what did you make it from a purely speech perspective? Was it well written? Was it well delivered?
There were good sections in it, but I think it didn't hang together. I thought it was a bit of a list. I thought it moved between things in a slightly odd fashion. The three big policy announcements were strangely orphaned. You had the HS2 up the front, then you had smoking, and then you had education, and nothing really linked them. And then there was a few sort of bits of attacks on woke. So I didn't feel it really flowed as a speech. And I felt, too, there were a few things where he gestured at something and then abandoned it. So, for example, he opened up the idea that he might defend Brexit and say why Brexit is working from his point of view. And then that fizzled out really quickly. And a defence of the record fizzled out really quickly. And there was a structural problem, which is that if you say, my main message is we're going to change, everything's got to change, it becomes very difficult to defend your own record. Because the thing from which you are changing is your own record. So structurally, I thought it was very difficult. And that's why speechwriting reveals real things. Because that structural problem is the one we're all talking about, which is the mess the government is in. And that's what the speech, I think, revealed.
I don't know what you thought, Nimco, but it was busier than I thought it would be at conference. Yeah. I'm not saying that was necessarily helpful to the Prime Minister, because it felt like an awful lot of it was around people like Liz Truss, who are just there basically throwing rocks from the sidelines. But there was a kind of chaotic energy to it, I guess.
I think it was busy, and it was also diverse as well. It was actually really good to see a lot more young people kind of turn up. And I was also there last year at the party conference in Birmingham, and that was a little bit more depressing, because I think a lot of the ministers were really solemn, or some of them had already just lost their jobs, or so on. But I think there was a level of excitement. And I think in terms of the speech, I think that's what I mean about the whole kind of change in him taking himself into the new era, is the fact that he said that he's made a decision on HS2, saying, well, this is what the book says. So I think that was kind of like, I've looked at the finances, this is the answer, things have changed. I don't think he was necessarily criticising the past, but he was just saying this is the choice now. And then the next stage about the conversation about smoking, saying the health of the future, our young people, as a father of 2 young girls, and then education as the thing that really brings aspiration. And I think that's what he was talking to from his immigrant kind of background, was the fact that through education you can go from 3 generations from having nothing to being Prime Minister.
We'll have more from you in a minute, so I know you probably want to always more to say, but you will get to say it, don't worry. Still to come on the Politics Hub. It might have been the worst-kept secret this conference, but the decision to scrap the high-speed link to Manchester has sparked fury among Northern leaders. Henri Murrison, the head of the Northern Powerhouse partnership, says the decision is a national tragedy. He's coming up after the break.
I'm Mark Stone, and I'm correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Wall Street! High Street!
Well, the plan seems to be to head to the police station where the policeman who fired the shots was based.
And everything his memories is all gone.
In almost every corner, this town has been completely destroyed by the fire. I've witnessed the remarkable passion for politics here, but the anger too.
Trump out of the White House.
Is this the moment to reform gun laws?
It's easy to go to politics.
But it's important. It's at the heart of the issue.
I get that that's where the media likes to go.
Well, it's not. It's where many of the people we've talked to here like to go.
I report on the biggest stories from around the world. This is a town that is effectively encircled by the Russians. You say it's all fabrication, what's happening in Bucha?
Destroyed my nation.
We take you to the heart of stories that shape our planet. Yeah, I can hear now quite a few explosions in the distance here in Jerusalem. A very violent series of confrontations here. What do you think of ISIS?
Everybody here knows the truth of ISIS.
Hello, welcome back. Well, let's have a look now at what stories we've been covering on our digital politics hub, which has been across all of today's developments. There's loads of reaction to the Prime Minister's speech, as you'd expect, but we did pick this out. Rishi Sunak brings the Education Secretary to tears. Here's Gillian Keegan here. She's achieved, to be fair to her, quite a lot of what she set out to do, whether it's T-levels. Come on, Gillian, it wasn't that bad, but maybe it's tears of happiness, you never know. Now, as you would expect, there's lots of reaction to that announcement on HS2. Not all of it is critical. This is here we go, Bradford councillor Susan Hinchcliffe cautiously welcoming the announcement, which would benefit her city. She did say, though, the devil is in the detail. And one of my favourite parts of the Politics Hub, our pledge tracker, where we're keeping an eye on those 5 pledges that the Prime Minister made in January. Not promises necessarily relating to HS2. This is our pledge tracker. And you can click each of the tabs, have a play at home to see how he's getting on those. Now, if you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all the latest on the Hub throughout the day. So, the politics of HS2 aside, how will scrapping the high-speed link to Manchester actually work? Well, Rishi Sunak says that £36 billion will be invested into other rail and road projects in the North and Midlands as part of a new Network North project. The £12 billion earmarked to link Manchester and Liverpool under the original project will be protected. And the money will also be used to fund a new Midlands rail hub, which the Prime Minister says will connect 50 stations. In addition, there will be new investment in upgrading roads, including the A1, A2, A5 and the M6. Well, our business correspondent Paul Kelsey has this report.
In Manchester, only the trams were running. A strike shut the railways for a day, while inside a former station, the trains of the future were cancelled by a Prime Minister promising local links in place of HS2.
I am disgusted, but I'm not. Whatever the Tories do doesn't surprise me.
Well, I think he'd better do it, yeah. Needs improvement. I was waiting about 20 minutes for the bus this morning, never come.
It's sad and perhaps entirely unsurprising that it's the Manchester part that gets cancelled.
From the leaders who want high-speed rail to transport investment and opportunity north, there was fury.
It does not deliver that new line. It involves patching up existing lines and leaving us with a problem that still has not been fixed. So it doesn't work east-west, but nor does it work north-south either.
Businesses like this were counting on a high-speed boost. They make clean air units for the pharmaceutical industry. Watching the PM, the boss turned it blue.
I do feel like second-class citizens, but I guess if I were in Leeds, if I were in Liverpool, if I'm up in Scotland, I feel equally the same. It's like nothing exists past London, and how the hell somebody can come up to the heartland and say, oh, by the way, we're now going to chop you off. That's fantastic marketing.
HS2 will now end in Birmingham with a link to the West Coast Main Line, but it will now extend to Euston. A proposed £12 billion fast link from Liverpool to Manchester survives, enabling faster east-west travel. And the line to Hull will be electrified, all part of the third rail plan for the north in as many years.
In place of HS2, Rishi Sunak's promising more of this, better local transport links, and they'll doubtless be welcome, but it's less than 2 years since the government was promising it could do it all, and much of what he's promised isn't even new. So he may find that breaking the promise of high-speed rail to the north comes at a price in trust, in the time it takes to deliver these projects, and in the credibility of any infrastructure plan put forward by his government.
I just can't believe it.
This decision will cause chaos along the route, where families like the Froggates have endured compulsory purchase orders for land that may never be used.
The £36 billion that Rishi Sunak has announced is going to be spent on other levelling up projects in the north, which I think is wonderful. Can he just tell us or give us some clarity on how much money is going to be allocated in repairing the devastation and the work that HS2 have already done?
The government says the sell-off of HS2 land will begin soon, but Mr Sunak still needs the support of his northern MPs to get his plan through Parliament before an election that could yet put HS2 back on track. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Manchester.
Well, fair to say, Northern leaders are not happy. Earlier, I spoke to the chief executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, Henri Murrison. I asked him what he'd said to the Transport Minister, Hugh Merriman, when I just caught him talking to him before he came on set.
I mean, what Hugh said to me was, I asked Hugh very politely, what's happening to the hybrid bill? So that's the bit of legislation that would allow you to build HS2 from Crewe to Manchester. And it would also be the first phase of Northern Powerhouse Rail. So without becoming a real rail geek and getting everyone to switch off Sky News, it allows you to get from Manchester Piccadilly to the airport. And that is key, because the route we want, the route Northern leaders want to get from Liverpool to Leeds involves that section. It's the first part of that new East-West line, as well as being the end of the North-South line that has just been cancelled. Now, the point is here that we need the hybrid bill to be protected, because otherwise you put back building that first phase of the East-West line by probably around 7 years, and we're not going to accept that. So we're really clear with the government. They would need to bring a vote in Parliament to cancel that line. We would like them to rule out doing that as soon as possible. And the side benefit of that is it would mean that you could make a commitment as well, that we are 6 months from a general election probably. It should really be open to the next government, whoever that may be, whether they still want to build HS2. And continue the hybrid bill would give them that choice, because it would mean that if it was a Labour government, they could review the project themselves, work out if what Rishi said about sending trains on the West Coast Main Line to Manchester is a good or a bad idea, and then make their own decision, because I don't think one speech at one party conference can decide infrastructure policy for the next 100 years. It just doesn't work like that.
I mean this in the nicest possible way, but it feels like you're clinging onto hope a bit here.
So, on a very practical level, if the Prime Minister is a man of his words, and he wants to build Northern Powerhouse Rail from Liverpool through Leeds to Hull and onto the North East, then he needs that hybrid bill just as much as those who want to build HS2 in full. But it is a test for the government, because if they really want to build that Liverpool to Manchester line, a key part of getting across the Pennines, then they need to protect the hybrid bill. Now, the side benefit of it, of course, is that in any democracy, it doesn't really feel right to scrap much of the work and effort that a future government may want to take advantage of. And so, of course, it would give more options to the opposition for when they do potentially take over, either at this election or a future one. This could be revisited by any future government over the next few generations. Someone may come along and want to build HS2, and we shouldn't really rule that out just because this Prime Minister says he can't afford it.
You're someone who's worked a lot in the north of England. You believe in levelling up. Is this a betrayal of that agenda?
I think that it is very disappointing that the government doesn't see the value of the whole package, because the whole point was HS2 came first because it had been going for longer. So we started to get some benefits in productivity terms earlier. To have to wait for lines which are, I mean, the line between Bradford and Huddersfield is literally, that's being alluded to today, is literally just a line on a map. I mean, there is an old railway route there, but I mean, there's stuff in the way. I mean, on HS2, that we were at that stage a decade and a half ago. So what I wanted was some of those benefits north to south, whilst we waited for those east-west links to be improved. Now we're just going to have to wait. And the challenge is, will cities like Manchester that have been becoming more productive more quickly than London, will they keep pace? Will they be able to keep bringing in enough talent. And in the meantime, those links between here, for example, Cheshire to Birmingham, they would have really given Manchester a huge kickstart to its economy, which would have meant that when Northern Powerhouse Rail plugged in, Manchester was already thriving, Liverpool would already been thriving. Without the opportunities that come from delivering HS2, my biggest fear is that by the time they build Northern Powerhouse Rail, the north-south gap will be a cavern, and it will take even longer for us to start to see some of the economic benefits of that infrastructure, because the lower place you start from, the less able you are to take advantage of the infrastructure once it is built.
Now, as well as his plan for HS2, the Prime Minister also made some announcements on schools as part of a shake-up to the education system. He said that all pupils will study some form of maths and English until they're 18. He also said that he would combine A-levels with T-levels to form a new Advanced British Standard qualification. And to boost the number of teachers, the Prime Minister pledged bonuses of up to £30,000 for teachers of key subjects in the first 5 years of their career. Now, the former Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, joins us now. Thank you very much for being with us. In the speech, the Prime Minister said that where he is going to prioritise spending in the future, it's going to be around education. Do you welcome his message on education at this conference?
Well, there was a big emphasis on the young and the next generation and the kids, and that's obviously fantastic. I really welcome the smoking. I think the smoking was bold and ambitious, and I think we should all get behind it. Really good to see a government doing bold public health prevention. The education, well, the concept of the education package was right, that parity between vocational routes and also university routes, that's needing to be done. But it was very much about repackaging, I think, for me. And there was a big, big warning sign. This is going to take 12 years. So if you've got a child in, if you've got a 6-year-old in year 2, they're going to have left school by the time this comes in. And there are so many demanding, to-dos on that list for schools. I don't need to tell you the buildings, the shortages of teachers. Of course, there were some today. The fact that a third of our kids leave school without the basic qualifications, and also don't think school somehow is for them. So all of those things are the things that keep parents awake at night, and the fact that a fifth of kids don't go to school on a persistent basis at the moment. Those are all very here and now, and 12 years to repackage something seems to be avoiding some issues. And there's another point there where, yes, of course, A-levels and everyone can see the benefit of keeping options open for more subjects. But what about GCSEs? Is quite a debate growing, including from Kenneth Baker, that it's madness not to tackle GCSEs.
I just want to jump in, because I'm also wondering your view on the huge amount of policy churn that we've seen. I mean, T-levels were only introduced in 2020. If you look at the Department for Education Twitter feed, 2 days ago they said today is the start of T-levels week. They're doing hashtag T-levels week posts all this week, including today. It feels a little bit like just everything's changing all the time.
I mean, anyone that works in schools will tell you that there's just been a churn. We know there's been a churn in education ministers, but also in policy, and nothing stood still. What I've seen so far indicates that actually what I was talking about, changing the wrapper, some of those things will still be the same. So the routes towards vocational training will probably be some of the T-levels, because you just can't restructure that again. So it won't be as smooth on the inside, probably, as the Prime Minister would like it to be on the outside. But, that's 12 years in the making. The world changes in that time. And one of the things that, I would have liked to have heard more about was how we get our kids ready for that, new age of work with AI, with communication skills, with all of the things we know are coming down the track. So the concept's right, but there's some really immediate things that weren't touched on, and it's a bit of a wrapping up job, that one, I think.
Thank you very much for being on the programme. Really interesting to get your perspective.
Pleasure.
Still to come on the Politics Hub, when ex-Charter Murti introduced her husband, Rishi Sunak, today, she called him her best friend. Well, her comments, I guess they split reaction between cool or cringe, and it got us thinking, what impact can political spouses have on their partner's fortunes? We'll debate that next. welcome back. Now, political spouses tend to avoid the limelight, and Mrs Sunak, or rather Ekshata Murty, is no exception. So when she introduced Rishi Sunak's speech today, it was a genuine surprise. She said that she'd gatecrashed. She claimed not even her husband knew what she was going to say. Although, let's face it, he probably had a fair idea that she was going to be nice about him. Now, the last spouse to be deployed to introduce a conference leader speech was Gordon Brown's wife, Sarah Brown.
I know he's not a saint. He's messy, he's noisy, he gets up at a terrible hour, but I know that he wakes up every morning and goes to bed every evening thinking about the things that matter. I know he loves our country.
Now, of course, Gordon Brown did go on to lose at the next election. Other spouses didn't seem quite as willing to muck in. Cherie Blair had a thinly veiled disdain for conference.
Thank you for mentioning it. Back on the underground again soon. Darling, you were really trying very hard, and I think that's fantastic. There's a woman doing a really good job there, but I'm not answering you.
You're going to tell us how you feel about this last conference as the leader's wife?
How many times can a girl say no?
Surely you must have some feelings. After all, he has been the most successful Labour Prime Minister in history. I mean, presumably this is a very poignant moment for you.
How many times can a girl say no?
So, is using a spouse a mark of desperation or a game-changing secret weapon? We'll get the thoughts of Nimco and Phil's. That Cherie one was extraordinary.
She was, yeah.
Yeah. What did you make of the Ekshata Murty speech today?
Well, I mean, she's not an elected politician, and I'm very disinclined to be harsh on her. I think it is something where you think, well, we need another ambassador, we need someone else to say it. And it can't make that much difference. I mean, I think it's the sort of thing you do only do when you think, I'm in a weak position, I've got to do something.
Brown,
a bit like that, yeah. And so, therefore, we can't expect the speech either from his wife or from Rishi Sunak himself, for that matter, to make a significant difference to what is an underlying weak position. So the reason you do that in the first place is the reason why it can't work.
Do you think there's something about how we've spoken quite a lot about Rishi Sunak's wife, about her business dealings, about her tax status? Is this perhaps an effort to reclaim her in some ways?
I think it's a position for her to be able to speak for herself and just to see her as who she is, and as she said, as the Prime Minister's best friend. But I think what was really kind of stand out was the Barbie pink suit. I thought that kind of spoke to... I think they're very good on the PR. I have to say that the kind of the logos and everything else was very Obama-esque, and then her coming out in a pink Barbie suit was actually quite a powerful speech. I think it's quite unfair to compare him to Gordon Brown, because I think he's a lot cooler than Gordon Brown. I think there's a different generational conversation, and Gordon Brown wasn't necessarily somebody that you could actually move in any direction. He was very much stiff, so I think they had to bring out another side of him through bringing his wife.
He's not that cool, Rishi Sunak, either, is he? I remember something, is it Star Trek that he's really into?
And Taylor Swift, did you see the little... do you know what, honestly, there was a little hint that I think spoke to a lot of people who from a different generation. I thought the little daddy kind of bracelet was very Taylor Swift and kind of did that. So I think they did it really well, and I thought even if it doesn't necessarily go down across the board well in those people who are very critical. I think we were just saying that the whole point is if you are neutral or if you don't mind him, then you would have thought that's okay. But if you dislike him, there's nothing the man can do in order for you to like him.
It's a hard act, isn't it? Prime Minister's wife or husband, we should say. I mean, Cherie, we saw there, she obviously was quite uncomfortable in that position.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, the best, not in this country, but the best obviously was Michelle Obama, who was fabulous at it, brilliant speaker in her own right. When they go low, we go high. She gave me the title of my book, little plug there. She's, but she was wonderful, wasn't she? I mean, she was fantastic at it. It is a hard thing to do, and it's not really, you can't expect much to come from it. It is an attempt, of course, to humanise the principle, to say, look, I've got a real life behind me. I'm not just the politician, I'm also a person. And that, modern politics demands that of us. And I felt that the obvious thing to do after that, in opening the speech, was to do a more extended personal section, and Sunak started in that way, and it was quite effective. The best line in the whole speech was, we saw Gillian Keegan wiping away a tear. It's because it was that really effective line about being proud to be an Asian Prime Minister, and the thing is, it's not a big deal. Really interesting line, I thought, and I would have, in fact, wanted to do more of that.
That's interesting, actually. And talking about the role of the wife, I mean, you obviously have friendship well publicised in the newspapers with Carrie Johnson, Boris Johnson, Morrison's wife. I mean, it is hard, I guess, particularly if you're like a strong woman, to try and find a way of navigating that role.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a difference between the Prime Minister's wives and the First Lady of America, because I think she gets an official role and an office. And I think one of the things that Michelle Gone talked about in her book was the fact that she was used for the election, but then sidelined as soon as she kind of came into him becoming Prime Minister. And I think that was similar to, President, which I think was similar to Cherie Booth, because she was a woman of her own.
I've got to jump in because we do have a bit of breaking news to bring you now. I'll come back to you in a moment. And because we have been hearing in the last few minutes, it's about a joke the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made during his speech earlier, where he made some comments about the former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and the fact she's been previously arrested as part of an investigation into the Scottish National Party's finances. Ms Sturgeon was released without charge back in June. Well, tonight, the pro-independence Alba Party have confirmed to Sky News that they've reported Mr Sunak to Police Scotland. They've accused the Prime Minister of interfering with their investigation and raising the question about contempt of court. As of right now, we are waiting to hear back from Police Scotland themselves. Still to come on the Politics Hub. The Home Secretary made it to conference that she's waging a war on woke to a rapturous reception. It's been a bit of a theme this week, but what is wokery and will attacking it win votes? That's next.